Let's get started. Story number 1.
The town of Coldwater was known for its harsh winters, but January had always been particularly brutal. Snow blanketed the streets like a suffocating shroud, and the wind howled relentlessly through the skeletal branches of the trees. The days were short, and the nights seemed to stretch on forever. It was during one such endless night that Evelyn Harlow moved into her late grandmother's house, an old Victorian perched on the edge of the woods. Evelyn had inherited the house after her grandmother passed in December, leaving behind cryptic warnings about the January curse. Her grandmother had always been a superstitious woman, and Evelyn dismissed the warnings as the ramblings of an aging mind. But as she turned the key in the lock that first night, a chill unrelated to the freezing air crept up her spine. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to have a presence of its own. Evelyn set her bags down in the foyer, her breath visible in the cold air. The heating system groaned when she turned it on, but warmth slowly began to seep into the walls. She explored the house with a mixture of nostalgia and unease. The furniture was just as she remembered, covered in sheets that made them look like ghosts frozen in time. It wasn't until she reached the attic that she felt something was truly off. The air was thick, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. She found a chest in the corner, its surface covered in dust. Inside were old photographs, brittle letters, and a leather-bound journal. The journal belonged to her grandmother, and the entries were dated every January for decades. Each entry spoke of strange occurrences: doors opening and closing on their own, whispers in the dead of night, and the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls. The last entry, written just days before her grandmother's death, read, "The shadow comes closer with each January. I fear this will be my last." Evelyn closed the journal, her hands trembling. She told herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her, but as the night wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She tried to sleep, but her dreams were plagued by dark figures and a sense of suffocation. The first incident happened the next morning. Evelyn was in the kitchen, making coffee, when she heard a loud crash upstairs. She rushed to investigate and found the mirror in her grandmother's bedroom shattered, the shards scattered across the floor. A single word was scrawled in the frost on the window: "Leave." Evelyn's logical mind tried to find an explanation. Maybe the glass had cracked due to the cold. Maybe the word was a trick of the condensation. But deep down, she knew better. She decided to stay, determined not to be driven out by fear. Over the next few days, the disturbances escalated. At night, she heard faint whispers, too low to make out, but they seemed to come from everywhere at once. Objects moved on their own. Her keys would vanish only to reappear in impossible places, like the freezer or the attic. The air in the house grew heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. One evening, while sorting through her grandmother's belongings, Evelyn found a photograph that made her blood run cold. It was a family portrait taken in front of the house many years ago. Everyone was smiling, except for a shadowy figure standing in the background, partially obscured by the trees. The figure was tall and indistinct, but its presence was unmistakably malevolent. Evelyn's grip on reality began to falter. She tried to reach out to friends, but the snowstorm that had swept into Coldwater made travel impossible. The phone lines were down, and her cell signal was spotty at best. She was trapped, alone with whatever was haunting the house. The turning point came on the night of January 15th. Evelyn was woken at exactly 3 a.m. by the sound of her grandmother's music box playing. She had packed the music box away in a box in the attic, yet there it was, sitting on the nightstand, its haunting melody filling the room. She stared at it, frozen, as the temperature in the room plummeted. Then she saw it. A shadowy figure stood at the foot of her bed, its form shifting like smoke, 2 pinpricks of light where its eyes should have been pierced through the darkness. Evelyn couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure leaned closer, and she felt a crushing weight on her chest, as though it were siphoning the very air from her lungs. In a moment of desperate clarity, she remembered her grandmother's journal. The last entry had mentioned an old ritual to ward off the shadow, something her grandmother had never had the courage to try. Evelyn bolted from the bed, her legs shaky but propelled by fear. She retrieved the journal and read the instructions aloud, her voice trembling as the figure loomed closer. The ritual involved lighting a candle and reciting a passage in Latin. Evelyn fumbled with the matches, her hands shaking as she struck one after another until a flame finally took hold. She recited the passage, her voice growing stronger with each word. The shadow writhed and screamed, the sound like nails on a chalkboard before it dissolved into nothingness. For the first time in days, the house was silent. Evelyn didn't sleep that night. She packed her belongings and left as soon as the sun rose. She never returned to Coldwater, leaving the house to be claimed by time and snow. The locals whispered about the curse of January, but Evelyn never spoke of what happened. Years later, she received a letter from a distant relative who had purchased the house. They wrote of strange occurrences, eerily similar to the ones Evelyn had experienced. Along with the letter was a photograph of the house taken in the snow. There, in the corner of the frame, was the shadow. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
The cold in Harrow's Ridge was different in January. Deeper, sharper, as if the chill carried whispers that snuck into your bones. The town was quiet, nearly frozen in time beneath a blanket of snow that dulled the world. It was in this month and in this place that Olivia learned what it meant to truly feel fear. She had always hated January. It marked the anniversary of her brother Michael's death. He had been only 8 years old, a bright spark of a boy extinguished far too soon. One moment he was playing on the frozen pond behind their house. The next, he was gone beneath the ice. Olivia, then only 10, had seen the whole thing and could never forgive herself for not saving him. Years later, now in her 30s, Olivia returned to Harrow's Ridge to settle her late parents' estate. Their house, a creaky Victorian at the edge of the woods, had been untouched for months. Snow piled against the windows, and the driveway was nearly impassable. The house welcomed her back with groaning floorboards and a cold draft that never seemed to leave, no matter how high she turned up the thermostat. She stayed out of necessity, determined to sort through the decades of memories and clutter left behind. But from the moment she stepped inside, something felt wrong. The air felt heavier, like the house was holding its breath. At first, Olivia dismissed it as grief and the oppressive winter weather. But then, small things began to happen. It started with noises. Faint tapping sounds echoed through the house at night, rhythmic and deliberate. She tried to convince herself it was just the wind or the house settling, but the sound always seemed to come from above her, following her from room to room. Then there was the smell, a faint, metallic scent that reminded her of iron, and it lingered no matter how many windows she opened. One night, as she sifted through a box of old family photographs, she found one that stopped her cold. It was a picture of her and Michael, taken the winter before he died. They stood in the backyard, bundled in coats and scarves, laughing as snowflakes fell around them. But in the background, barely visible among the trees, was a figure. It was shadowy, indistinct, but its shape was unmistakable. A tall, gaunt figure standing unnaturally still. Olivia stared at the photo for what felt like hours, trying to convince herself it was just a trick of the light or a flaw in the film. The next night, Olivia awoke to the sound of footsteps. They were soft but deliberate, moving slowly down the hallway outside her bedroom. She froze, heart hammering in her chest. She listened, holding her breath as the footsteps stopped just outside her door. The doorknob rattled, and she clutched the covers tighter. Then silence. Morning came, but it offered no comfort. Olivia found the front door standing wide open, snow drifting in across the threshold. She locked it the night before, she was sure of it. She began to question her sanity, wondering if the isolation and grief were playing tricks on her mind. But deep down, she knew there was something in the house, something that didn't want her there. Determined to find answers, Olivia ventured into the attic, a place she hadn't been in years. The air was colder up there, biting against her skin even beneath layers of clothing. She dug through boxes of old belongings, searching for... she wasn't sure what. Closure, perhaps. But what she found was something she wished she hadn't. In an old chest, buried beneath blankets and photographs, she discovered a small wooden box. Inside was a bundle of letters, written in her mother's handwriting. The letters were dated the January after Michael's death. As she read, Olivia's blood turned to ice. The dreams won't stop. one letter began. I see him every night, standing at the foot of my bed, his clothes wet and his eyes, oh God, his eyes. Another letter described hearing Michael's voice calling to her from the woods. He says he's cold. He begs me to let him in. But it's not Michael. I know it's not him. The final letter was the most chilling of all. I can't keep him out anymore. I've tried everything, but he's too strong. He wants us, all of us. I think he's always been here, waiting for January to come. Olivia dropped the letters, her hands shaking. Her mother had never spoken of these things, not once. But it explains so much. The way her parents had retreated into themselves every winter, their insistence on never being alone in the house during January. That night, Olivia couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every groan of the wind set her on edge. Around 3 a.m., she heard it again, the footsteps. But this time, they didn't stop outside her door. They continued into her room, slow and deliberate. She couldn't see anything in the darkness, but she could feel it. The air was heavier, colder. She forced herself to reach for the bedside lamp and flicked it on. The room was empty, but then she saw the wet footprints. They started at the doorway and stopped just inches from her bed. She stared at them, her breath hitching, when she heard a faint whisper. It was a voice she hadn't heard in over 2 decades. Livy. Her brother's nickname for her. The sound of it nearly broke her. She turned toward the sound, and there he was. Michael, or something that looked like him. He stood at the foot of her bed, his clothes dripping with water, his skin pale and waxy. His eyes were dark voids, and his mouth moved without sound for a moment before the words came. Why didn't you save me? Tears streamed down Olivia's face as she whispered, I tried. I swear I tried. Michael's face twisted, his features contorting into something inhuman. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around her. She felt a pressure on her chest, like hands pressing down, and she couldn't breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Michael, or the thing that had taken his shape, was gone. Olivia spent the rest of the night huddled in her car, engine running for warmth. By dawn, she had made up her mind to leave. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't Michael, and it wasn't something she could face alone. She returned only once, during the thaw in early February, to gather her things. The house was eerily silent, but she didn't linger. She locked the door for the last time and never looked back. Years later, Olivia would hear whispers about the house. Gets new owners complained of strange occurrences every January. Footsteps, whispers, wet footprints. Some said they saw a boy standing at the edge of the woods, his eyes black as night. But Olivia never spoke of what she saw, not to anyone. She carried the weight of it alone, knowing that some ghosts don't rest, especially in January. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The town of Frosthaven sat nestled in a valley surrounded by dense woods. In the dead of winter, when January brought its bitter cold, the town seemed almost forgotten by time. The snow fell endlessly, muffling all sound, and the long nights stretched like a curtain over the world. It was the perfect place for secrets to fester and for stories to grow into legends. One such legend was about the Frosthaven boarding house, abandoned for decades, but still standing on the outskirts of town. Locals whispered that it was cursed, that no one who stayed there during January ever came back unchanged. Or at all. Teenagers dared each other to sneak inside, but none stayed past sunset. The stories were always the same. Shadows that moved without light, voices that came from nowhere, and a sense of being watched by something that wasn't human. For Marissa Caldwell, a struggling freelance photographer, the stories were just that, stories. She had spent years debunking urban legends, turning the truth into gritty, compelling features for niche magazines. When she heard about the boarding house while visiting Frosthaven, she knew she had found her next project. She booked a week-long stay at a nearby inn and planned to spend her days and nights documenting the house. The boarding house was a hulking structure of weathered wood and broken windows, its facade half buried in snow. The air around it felt colder than the rest of Frosthaven, and Marissa felt the weight of it the moment she stepped inside. The door creaked ominously as it swung open, revealing a dim hallway lined with peeling wallpaper and warped floorboards. She spent the first day exploring, photographing every crevice of the house. The main floor had a dining room with overturned chairs and a kitchen littered with rusted utensils. Upstairs were rows of small, sparsely furnished rooms, each one bearing the marks of abandonment. Water-stained ceilings, faded linens, and broken furniture. The attic was the most unsettling, with its low, slanted ceiling and a single chair facing a boarded-up window. Marissa set up her camera equipment in the largest room on the second floor. She decided to stay the night, determined to capture anything unusual. The hours ticked by uneventfully as she reviewed her photos and took notes. But as the clock struck midnight, she began to feel it, a presence. The air grew colder, and the sound of the wind outside seemed to vanish entirely. At first it was subtle, a faint creak of the floorboards in the hallway, a whisper so soft she thought she imagined it. Then came the knocking. It was slow and deliberate, 3 sharp raps against the door to her room. Marissa froze, her breath visible in the icy air. Gathering her courage, she opened the door, but the hallway was empty. The only sign that something had been there was the faint impression of wet footprints leading down the hall. Determined to document everything, she grabbed her camera and followed the footprints, which disappeared at the staircase leading to the attic. Marissa hesitated. Something about the attic felt wrong, but her curiosity outweighed her fear. She climbed the creaking stairs, each step echoing louder than the last. The attic was dark, lit only by the weak beam of her flashlight. The chair by the boarded-up window was empty, but as she stepped closer, she noticed something carved into the floorboards beneath it, a series of names, etched deeply into the wood. She ran her fingers over the letters, recognizing some from the stories she had heard, people who had vanished after staying in the boarding house. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out. Panic rose in her chest as she fumbled with it, but before she could fix it, she heard a voice. It was a low, guttural whisper, coming from the shadows. "Why did you come here?" The flashlight sputtered back to life, illuminating the chair and the figure now sitting in it. It was a man, or at least it had been. His skin was ashen and stretched too tightly over his bones, his eyes black pits that seemed to swallow the light. Marissa stumbled back, her camera clattering to the floor. "You shouldn't have come," the figure rasped, its voice echoing unnaturally. The air around her grew impossibly cold, and she felt a pressure in her chest, as if the room itself was trying to crush her. Marissa turned and bolted, stumbling down the attic stairs and back to her room. She locked the door and pressed her back against it, trying to catch her breath, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, surrounding her, until she could no longer tell where they were coming from. "Get out," they hissed. "Leave before it takes you." She didn't need to be told twice. Abandoning her equipment, Marissa fled the boarding house and didn't stop running until she reached her car. The engine sputtered to life, and she sped away, the headlights barely piercing through the heavy snow. When she returned to her inn, she locked herself in her room and refused to speak to anyone. That night, she reviewed the photos on her backup memory card, the only equipment she had managed to save. Most were normal, empty rooms and hallways, but one stood out. It was a photo of the attic chair. In the frame, a figure loomed behind it, its face twisted in a grotesque grin, and in its hand it held her camera. Marissa left Frosthaven the next day, vowing never to return. She published her story under a pseudonym, but even then, she left out the worst of it. The locals would say she was lucky. January didn't let everyone leave. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The snow in Maple Hollow never melted in January. It clung to the ground, weighing down the trees and turning the small town into a frozen painting. The air was bitter, sharp enough to cut through thick coats, and the days were so short they barely seemed to exist. For Emma Wallace, it was the perfect time to finally get some peace and solitude, or so she thought. Emma had always been a city girl, but after a messy breakup and a year that felt like it had taken more than it gave, she craved isolation. When she stumbled upon a listing for a remote cabin in the woods, she booked it without hesitation. It was old but cozy, with a wood-burning stove and a view of the frozen lake nearby. The owner had warned her that the area was isolated and the nearest neighbor was several miles away, but that was exactly what she wanted. No people, no noise, just silence. She arrived on January 5th, her car tires crunching over the snow-covered driveway. The cabin was exactly as advertised, small, rustic, and surrounded by towering pines. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke. She set her bags down, lit a fire in the stove, and settled in for what she hoped would be a quiet month of reading, writing, and forgetting the world. The first few days were uneventful. She spent her mornings walking along the edge of the frozen lake, marveling at the stillness of the forest. At night, she sat by the fire, jotting down ideas for the novel she'd been meaning to write. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional groan of the wind. It was perfect. But by the end of the first week, things began to change. It started with small, almost imperceptible things. The sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside when she knew she was alone. The faint smell of something metallic that lingered in the air but vanished as quickly as it appeared. At first, she chalked it up to her imagination, the product of too much time alone in an unfamiliar place. Then came the knocking. It was late, past midnight, and the fire had burned down to embers. Emma was curled up on the couch with a blanket when she heard it. 3 sharp knocks on the front door. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Who could it be at this hour? The cabin was miles from the nearest road, and the snowstorm earlier that evening had made the driveway impassable. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. Heart pounding, she opened the door just a crack and looked out into the night. The porch was empty, the snow undisturbed. She quickly shut and locked the door, trying to convince herself that it had been the wind or some animal. But deep down, she knew better. The next day, Emma woke to find footprints in the snow outside the cabin. They led from the edge of the woods to her front door, but stopped there as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had simply vanished. The prints were strange, too large to belong to any animal she knew of, and oddly misshapen, like they had been made by bare feet with too many toes. She spent the day trying to shake the unease that had settled over her. She checked the locks on the doors and windows, even going so far as to push a chair under the doorknob for extra security. But as night fell, the sense of being watched only grew stronger. That evening, the knocking returned. This time, it wasn't just at the front door. It came from the windows, the back door, even the walls. It was as if something or someone was circling the cabin, testing every possible way in. Emma sat in the center of the room, clutching the fireplace poker like a lifeline, her eyes darting to every shadow. The knocking stopped after what felt like hours, leaving behind an oppressive silence. When dawn finally came, Emma decided she'd had enough. She packed her things, ready to leave the cabin and never look back. But when she stepped outside, her heart sank. The driveway was buried under feet of snow and her car was completely blocked in. There was no way she could leave without help. She tried her phone, but the signal was gone. As the day wore on, the unease turned into outright fear. The strange metallic smell returned, stronger this time, and she swore she could hear whispers in the wind. By nightfall, she was too scared to turn off the lights. She sat on the couch, staring at the door, waiting for the inevitable. At exactly 3 a.m., the knocking began again. It was louder now, more insistent, shaking the door in its frame. Emma didn't move, her grip on the poker tightening as she tried to stay calm. But then the knocking stopped, and she heard the sound of the doorknob turning. The door didn't open. She had locked it and wedged the chair beneath it, but the sound of the knob twisting back and forth was unmistakable. Her eyes darted to the windows, and that's when she saw it. A figure stood just beyond the glass, its outline barely visible in the moonlight. It was tall, impossibly so, its head nearly brushing the top of the window. Its face was obscured, but its eyes, 2 pinpricks of light, pierced through the darkness, staring directly at her. Emma screamed, scrambling backward as the figure pressed a hand against the glass. The hand was pale, almost translucent, with fingers that were far too long. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the air in the room grew colder, the fire in the stove sputtering out as frost crept up the windows. Emma didn't remember falling asleep, but when she woke, it was daylight. The figure was gone, and the snow outside the cabin was undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. But she knew it hadn't been a dream. The metallic smell still lingered, and the frost on the windows was in the shape of a handprint. She spent the rest of the day trying to dig her car out, her desperation growing with every shovelful of snow. By the time night fell, she was exhausted, but no closer to escape. She locked herself in the bedroom, barricading the door with furniture, and sat with her back against the wall, staring at the door. That night, the knocking came again, but this time it was inside the house. The sound moved from room to room, growing louder and closer with each knock. Emma clutched the poker, her hands trembling as the knocking stopped just outside the bedroom door. She held her breath, praying it would go away. Then she heard it. A voice, low and guttural, whispering her name. Emma, she screamed as the door shook violently, the furniture scraping against the floor. The lights flickered, and the room filled with that metallic smell, so strong it made her gag. The voice came again, louder this time, filled with rage. Emma, why won't you let me in? She didn't answer, didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The room was silent, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. Emma stayed awake until dawn, too terrified to close her eyes. When the sun rose, she grabbed her things and ran. She didn't care about the car, the snow, or the distance to the nearest road. She just ran, stumbling through the woods until she reached a ranger station miles away. Emma never returned to the cabin. She left Maple Hollow the next day, but the experience haunted her. She never told anyone the full story, afraid they'd think she was crazy. But every January, when the nights were long and the air was cold, she swore she could still hear the knocking. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The town of Coldwater was no stranger to bitter winters. Nestled deep in the mountains, January was a season of isolation, where the roads were often impassable and the nights stretched on forever. For years, people spoke of an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a place whispered about in hushed tones. It was said that the Thomason farmhouse was cursed, that something dark lingered there long after the family who owned it had vanished without a trace. When Olivia Price moved to Coldwater, she knew nothing about the farmhouse or its grim reputation. She had left the bustle of city life behind, hoping the remote town would help her recover from the loss of her husband. A freelance writer, Olivia planned to spend the cold, quiet month of January working on her latest book and finding solace in the stillness of the mountains. She found a rental listing for a cabin just outside town. The price was suspiciously low, but the pictures showed a charming rustic home surrounded by snow-dusted trees. It seemed perfect. She booked it immediately, eager for a fresh start. The locals were kind when she arrived, but strangely evasive when she mentioned the cabin. One elderly woman at the grocery store paused when Olivia described it, her expression darkening. "You mean the old Thomason place," she said quietly. "Be careful up there." Olivia brushed it off. Small towns always had their share of strange rumors and superstitions. She arrived at the cabin on January 3rd, the snow crunching beneath her boots as she carried her bags inside. It was colder than she expected, the kind of chill that seemed to seep into her bones, but the cabin was cozy enough once she got the fire going. The first few days were uneventful. Olivia spent her mornings writing, her afternoons hiking through the snow-covered woods, and her evenings curled up by the fire with a book. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional gust of wind. She felt like she had stepped into another world, far removed from her grief and the chaos of her old life. But by the end of the first week, the strange occurrences began. It started with the sounds. Soft footsteps upstairs when she was alone, the faint creak of a rocking chair moving somewhere in the house. At first, she thought it was the old wood settling or the wind playing tricks on her ears. But the sounds grew more distinct, more deliberate. One night, as she sat by the fire, she heard a faint whisper. It was so soft she almost didn't notice it, but it sent a shiver down her spine. She turned off the music she had playing on her phone and listened. The whisper came again, barely audible, but unmistakable. It sounded like someone saying her name. "Olivia?" Her heart pounded as she searched the cabin, checking every room and corner. There was no one there. She tried to laugh it off, convincing herself it was just her imagination, but the unease lingered. The next morning, she found footprints in the snow outside the cabin. They led from the edge of the woods to her front porch, but didn't continue away. It was as if someone or something had walked up to the cabin and disappeared. The prints were strange, too long and narrow to belong to a person, but not quite animal-like either. As the days went on, the activity escalated. Doors that she was certain she had closed would be wide open when she returned to the room. Her laptop would turn on by itself, strange words appearing on the screen as if someone was typing them. Leave. It's not safe. She's coming. Olivia tried to contact the rental agency to see if someone had access to the cabin, but her calls went unanswered. She considered leaving, but the snowstorm that hit on January 15th made the roads impassable. She was trapped. That night, the whispers grew louder. They echoed through the cabin, coming from every direction. Olivia locked herself in the bedroom, her back pressed against the door as she listened to the sounds of footsteps moving down the hallway. Something scratched at the walls, slow and deliberate, like nails dragging across the wood. At exactly 3 a.m., she heard a loud bang from the kitchen. Gathering her courage, she opened the bedroom door and crept down the hall. The air was frigid, her breath visible in the faint light of her flashlight. When she reached the kitchen, she stopped dead in her tracks. The words, "Get out," were scrawled across the frosted window, the letters jagged and uneven. Her stomach churned as she backed away, her flashlight flickering. Then, from the corner of the room, she saw it, a figure standing in the shadows. It was a woman, or at least what remained of one. Her skin was pale and translucent, her eyes empty sockets that oozed darkness. She wore a tattered dress that seemed to shift and move as if caught in an invisible wind. Her head tilted unnaturally as she stared at Olivia. "Leave," the figure hissed, her voice like the sound of cracking ice. "Before it takes you too." Olivia ran. She barricaded herself in the bedroom and spent the rest of the night clutching a heavy flashlight, praying for dawn. When morning came, the figure was gone, but the frost-covered words remained on the window. The house was silent, but the air felt heavy, as if it were waiting. Desperate, Olivia packed her things and set out on foot, determined to reach the main road. The snow was deep, and the cold bit at her face, but she pushed on. As she neared the edge of the woods, she felt it, a presence, watching her. She turned and saw the woman again, standing among the trees, her empty eyes fixed on Olivia. "Don't look back," the woman whispered, her voice carried by the wind. "Don't stop. Run." Olivia did as she was told, running until she reached the road, where a passing snowplow driver found her. She never returned to the cabin, and when she tried to contact the rental agency again, she found no record of her booking. The Thomason farmhouse burned to the ground a week later, a fire that no one could explain. The locals said it was for the best, that the place had claimed too many lives over the years. Olivia left Coldwater, but the experience stayed with her. Every January, she avoided the woods, the snow, and the silence. Some nights, when the wind howled, she swore she could still hear the woman's voice, whispering a warning from the shadows. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The cold in January was unforgiving, the kind that settled deep in your bones and refused to leave. Harper Delaney had moved back to her childhood home in a small, snow-covered town in northern Maine after her mother passed away. The old Victorian house had been in the family for generations, and despite its creaking floors and drafty windows, it was filled with memories. Some warm, some haunting. Harper's return was meant to be temporary. She planned to sort through her mother's belongings, put the house up for sale, and leave the town behind for good. She wasn't prepared for the weight of the place, how the walls seemed to breathe with a life of their own, or how the long nights felt heavier as the snow piled higher outside. The house had always been strange. As a child, Harper would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of faint footsteps in the hallway or whispers just outside her door. Her mother had always dismissed it, saying it was just the old house settling or the wind. But Harper knew better. There was something else there, something unseen but undeniably present. The first week of January passed uneventfully, aside from the bitter cold that seemed to seep into every corner of the house. Harper busied herself with sorting through boxes in the attic, rediscovering old family photos and trinkets. She felt a pang of nostalgia as she flipped through a photo album, her mother's smiling face staring back at her. It was almost enough to make her forget the unease that lingered in the air. But then the strange occurrences began. It started with the clocks. Harper had never been much for superstition, but when every clock in the house stopped at exactly 3:17 a.m., it unnerved her. She replaced the batteries, thinking it was a coincidence, but the next night, it happened again. The silence in the house during those moments was suffocating, as if the world had paused. Then there were the shadows. Harper first noticed them while working in the attic late one night. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long, flickering shadows across the room, but one of them didn't belong. It moved independently, shifting and stretching in ways that didn't match her movements or the light. She told herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew better. The whispers began on January 10th. Harper was in the kitchen washing dishes when she heard it, a faint voice, almost too soft to discern, calling her name. Harper, she froze, the plate slipping from her hands and shattering in the sink. The voice had come from the hallway, but when she looked, no one was there. Her heart raced as she checked every room, but the house was empty. She tried to brush it off as stress or exhaustion, but the whispers continued, growing louder each night. By mid-January, Harper could no longer deny that something was wrong. The house felt different, heavier, as if it were pressing down on her. She started sleeping with the lights on, but even that didn't help. She'd wake in the middle of the night to find her bedroom door open, even though she was certain she had closed it. Once, she woke to find the rocking chair in the corner of the room swaying gently, as if someone had just been sitting there. The breaking point came on January 21st. Harper had fallen asleep on the couch in the living room, a fire crackling weakly in the hearth. She woke to the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. Her stomach twisted as she realized she wasn't alone. Grabbing the fire poker, she crept toward the staircase, her heart pounding in her ears. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was only silence. Then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping like someone gently knocking on the wall. It came from her mother's old bedroom. Taking a deep breath, Harper climbed the stairs, her grip on the poker tightening. The tapping grew louder as she approached the door, which was slightly ajar. She pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking. The room was empty, but the tapping continued, coming from the wall near the bed. Harper stepped closer, her breath visible in the icy air. The tapping stopped, replaced by a voice that sent a chill down her spine. "Help me." Harper staggered back, her mind racing. The voice was faint but unmistakable, and it seemed to be coming from inside the wall. She hesitated, then pressed her ear against it, her hands trembling. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Please, help me." Before she could react, the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began to creep up the windows, and the fire poker in her hand felt as cold as ice. Harper turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. Panic set in as the room filled with an oppressive energy, the air thick and heavy. Shadows swirled around her, coalescing into a figure that stood at the foot of the bed. It was a woman, her face pale and hollow, her eyes empty sockets, seemed to stare straight through Harper. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, her voice low and echoing. "This house belongs to the lost." Harper backed away, her legs shaking. "Who are you? What do you want?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Find her," she said. "Free her, or you will never leave." The room went dark, and Harper felt a rush of cold air as the door flew open behind her. She didn't hesitate. Running down the stairs and out of the house into the freezing night, she drove to the nearest motel, vowing never to return. But the house wouldn't let her go so easily. The dreams began that night. Vivid, terrifying visions of a young girl trapped in the walls, her hands clawing desperately at the plaster. Harper woke each time, drenched in sweat, the girl's voice echoing in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was calling her back. On January 25th, Harper returned to the house, determined to find answers. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, she went to her mother's old bedroom. The tapping began as soon as she entered, faint but persistent. She tore into the wall, the plaster crumbling away to reveal a small, hidden space. Inside, she found a bundle of old, tattered blankets. Unwrapping them, she uncovered a tiny skeleton, the remains of a child no older than 5. Tears streamed down Harper's face as the pieces fell into place. The whispers, the shadows, the tapping, it was the girl, trying to be found. Her mother must have known, must have hidden this terrible secret for years. "I'm so sorry," Harper whispered, her voice breaking. The room grew warm. the oppressive energy lifting as a soft light filled the space. Harper felt a sense of peace wash over her, as if the house itself was exhaling after holding its breath for decades. She left the house that night and called the authorities. The remains were identified as belonging to a girl who had gone missing in the 1950s, a case that had haunted the town for generations. With the truth finally revealed, the whispers and shadows ceased. Harper never returned to the house after that. She sold it to a developer who tore it down to make way for new homes. But every January, when the nights are long and the air is cold, she still dreams of the girl, her voice soft and thankful. Story the end.
Story number 7.
January in the mountains was brutal, but Emma had no choice. She'd inherited her uncle's remote cabin after his sudden and mysterious death the year prior. She wasn't particularly close to him. Her uncle Robert was the eccentric black sheep of the family, known for his reclusive nature and strange stories about the supernatural. Still, she couldn't pass up the opportunity to escape her chaotic city life for a quiet month of reflection. The cabin sat deep in the woods, surrounded by nothing but towering evergreens and thick layers of snow. It was beautiful, but unsettling, the kind of isolation that made you feel small and exposed. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the winding mountain road leading to the cabin was barely passable even in the best weather. When Emma arrived on January 3rd, she noticed something odd right away. The cabin door was unlocked, though she was certain she'd locked it after her last visit in the fall. Inside, the air felt heavy and cold, despite the fireplace and the wood-burning stove. She chalked it up to the weather and set about settling in, unpacking her bags and lighting the fire. The first few nights passed without incident, but the cabin had a way of making her feel watched. Shadows stretched too long in the flickering firelight, and she often thought she heard faint sounds, soft thuds, distant whispers, or the creak of footsteps across the wooden floor. She told herself it was just her imagination or the old house settling in the cold. On the night of January 8th, things changed. Emma woke abruptly at 2:57 a.m., her breath visible in the freezing air despite the fire still burning in the hearth. Something had pulled her from her sleep, though she couldn't pinpoint what. Then she heard it, a faint knock coming from the front door. Knock. 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 Her stomach twisted. No one should be out here in the middle of the night, especially not during a snowstorm. Grabbing a flashlight, she cautiously approached the door. She hesitated before opening it and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" There was no answer, just the sound of the wind howling through the trees. She opened the door a crack and shone her flashlight outside. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, but there were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. The knocking, it seemed, had come from nowhere. Emma locked the door and returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The knocking continued the next night, always at 2:57 a.m., always 3 knocks. Each time, there was no one outside, no tracks in the snow. By January 10th, she was too scared to sleep, staying awake by the fire, clutching a kitchen knife for comfort. That night, the knocking came again, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a low, mournful whisper. "Let me in." Emma's blood ran cold. The voice was barely audible, but it was there, just beyond the door. Summoning her courage, she shouted, "Who are you? What do you want?" The whisper came again, more insistent. "Please, let me in." Emma didn't open the door. Instead, she spent the night curled up in the corner of the living room, the knife still in her hand, until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. The following day, she decided to search the cabin for answers. Her uncle had been a strange man, and she suspected he might have left some clue about the house's eerie nature. In the attic, she found a locked trunk covered in dust. Using a screwdriver, she pried it open and discovered a collection of old journals, photographs, and newspaper clippings. The photos were black and white, showing the cabin as it had looked decades ago. One picture caught her attention. A group of men standing in front of the cabin, their faces grim. In the background, a shadowy figure stood by the tree line, barely visible but unmistakably human. Her uncle had circled the figure in red ink and written, "The Watcher." The journals were filled with ramblings about the Watcher, a malevolent spirit that, according to Robert, had haunted the cabin for generations. He described hearing the knocking, the whispers, and seeing the shadowy figure in the woods. One entry, dated January 15th of the previous year, read, "It wants to come inside. I can't let it in. Not again." Emma's hands shook as she read the final line. "If you hear it knocking, don't answer, no matter what." That night, she stayed awake again, the journal clutched in her hands. At 2:57 a.m., the knocking returned, louder than ever. Knock, knock, knock. "Let me in," the voice begged, its tone now desperate and furious. The cabin grew colder, the fire flickering weakly in the hearth. Shadows danced across the walls, and Emma swore she saw something moving just outside the window, a tall, dark figure, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. "Go away," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "You're not welcome here." The voice fell silent, but the sense of dread remained. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night, too afraid of what might happen if she closed her eyes. On January 17th, she decided she couldn't stay any longer. She packed her bags and prepared to leave, but the snowstorm that hit that morning made the roads impassable. She was trapped. That night, the knocking didn't come. Instead, she woke to the sound of footsteps inside the cabin. They were slow and deliberate, moving from room to room. Clutching the journal, she crept down the stairs, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The footsteps stopped in the living room. When Emma entered, she froze. The front door was wide open, snow blowing in, and standing in the doorway was the shadowy figure from the photograph. Its form was indistinct, shifting and flickering like smoke, but its eyes, empty, hollow voids, locked onto hers. "You let me in?" it said, its voice a guttural rasp. Emma backed away, but the figure advanced, its presence filling the room with an unbearable cold. She tripped and fell, the journal spilling open beside her. Desperate, she grabbed it and screamed, "You can't have me! You don't belong here!" The figure hesitated, its form wavering. The room filled with a deafening roar, as if the cabin itself was fighting back. The figure let out an unearthly shriek and dissolved into the shadows, leaving the room silent once more. Emma didn't stay to see if it would return. At first light, she braved the snow-covered roads and never looked back. The cabin remains abandoned to this day, buried under layers of snow and secrets. Locals say no one has stayed there since Emma, and those who pass by on the mountain road claim they can still hear faint knocking in the dead of night. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The first time Claire felt it, she was standing in her living room, looking out over the snow-covered street. It was late January, the coldest it had been all winter, and the frost on the windows made everything look hazy. She had only moved into the old townhouse 3 weeks ago, thrilled by the idea of starting fresh after her divorce. It was an unassuming place, built in the early 1900s with creaky floorboards and a charm she found irresistible. But that day, something about the house felt different, off, almost alive. It started with the smell, faint at first but unmistakable, a trace of something burning, wood or maybe something more acrid. Claire checked the fireplace, but it was cold and empty. The smell lingered for a few moments, then disappeared just as quickly as it had come. She dismissed it as an oddity of the old house. Houses settled, pipes hissed, smells drifted in from neighbors. It was nothing, or so she thought. The following evening, Claire was unpacking a box of books in her study when the sound began. A soft, rhythmic creaking, like footsteps moving up the staircase. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The stairs were just outside the study door, and the sound was unmistakable. One step, then another, slow and deliberate. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaking. There was no response, but the creaking stopped. Gathering her courage, she opened the study door and looked out. The staircase was empty. She exhaled in relief, telling herself it was just the old wood contracting in the cold. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, Claire dreamed of the house. In her dream, the walls were covered in black soot, and a thick, suffocating smoke filled the air. She could hear someone crying, a low, mournful wail that echoed through the hallways. She woke with a start, her bedroom cold despite the heater running on high. For a moment, she thought she could still hear the crying, faint and distant. By the third week of January, the disturbances had become harder to ignore. Lights flickered unpredictably, no matter how many times the electrician assured her the wiring was fine. Objects moved ever so slightly, Her keys left on the kitchen counter would appear on the dining table, and doors she knew she'd closed would be ajar. It wasn't until January 25th that Claire began to truly question her sanity. She was working late in the study when she heard it again, the footsteps on the stairs. This time, they were accompanied by something else, a faint humming, a soft melody that was both soothing and deeply unsettling. She stood, her hands trembling, and opened the study door. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her chest. The humming stopped, replaced by silence. And then from the top of the staircase, she saw it. A figure, a woman, pale and gaunt, her long hair matted and damp as if she'd just climbed out of a river. The woman's eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pull at Claire's very soul. Claire stumbled back, slamming the door shut. She pressed her back against it, her mind racing. When she finally found the courage to open the door again, the hallway was empty. The next morning, Claire went to the local library to research the history of her house. She combed through old records, newspapers, and anything she could find. It took hours, but eventually she found what she was looking for. In 1918, a fire had swept through the house, killing a woman named Margaret Sinclair and her 2 young children. The article described how the fire had started in the middle of the night, likely from a candle left burning. Margaret had been found near the staircase, her body burned beyond recognition. Her children were never found. Claire sat in the library, her hands shaking as she read. The tragedy had happened over 100 years ago, yet the house still seemed to carry the weight of it. She couldn't help but wonder if Margaret was the figure she'd seen. That night, Claire decided to confront whatever was haunting her home. She lit candles in the living room and sat in the center of the floor, her hands clutching a photo she'd found of Margaret Sinclair in the library archives. "I know you're here," she said aloud, her voice steady. "I don't mean you any harm. If you need something, tell me, please." The room grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that Claire could see her breath. The candles flickered, their flames bending as if caught in a strong wind. And then she heard it, the humming, soft and sorrowful, filling the room. Claire closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. "What do you want?" she whispered. When she opened her eyes, the figure was standing in front of her. Margaret's form was more solid now, her features clearer. Tears streamed down her ashen face, and she reached out a trembling hand. Claire didn't move, too terrified to speak. Margaret's lips parted, and her voice came out as a faint whisper, barely audible. "Help them." And just like that, she vanished, leaving the room eerily silent. The next morning, Claire called a local historian she'd met at the library and explained what she had found. Together, they searched the property, digging into the frozen ground near the house's foundation. It wasn't long before they uncovered what Claire feared most, the tiny, charred remains of 2 small children. Claire arranged for a proper burial for Margaret and her children, ensuring their names were engraved on a headstone. The moment the service ended, she felt a weight lift from her chest, as if the house itself had exhaled a long-held breath. For the first time in weeks, the house was quiet. The footsteps, the flickering lights, the humming, all of it stopped. Claire stayed in the townhouse for another year, never once experiencing anything strange again. But every January, when the air turns bitter and the snow blankets the ground, she lights a candle in her living room and hums the soft melody Margaret once sang, a small tribute to the woman and her children who finally found peace.
Story the end.
Story number 9.
Here's a realistic and chilling ghost story set in the cold, unforgiving month of January. The snow began to fall on New Year's Day, heavy flakes swirling in the wind like pale ashes from a long-forgotten fire. Karen pulled her scarf tighter around her face as she trudged up the winding road to the old house that had belonged to her late Aunt Mildred. Mildred had passed away in December, leaving Karen as the sole heir. The house was old, cold, and isolated, perched at the edge of a forest that had stood for centuries. Karen had been reluctant to take the trip, but the lawyer handling Mildred's estate had been insistent. "It's better to take care of these things sooner rather than later," he'd said over the phone. So, with the holiday season behind her and no pressing obligations, Karen decided January was as good a time as any to settle the affairs. The house loomed ahead, its dark windows staring like empty sockets. The driveway had been blanketed by snow, forcing Karen to park at the base of the hill and hike the rest of the way. By the time she reached the front door, her boots were soaked and her fingers were numb despite her gloves. The house was exactly as she remembered from her childhood visits. Tall ceilings, creaky wooden floors, and a persistent chill no amount of firewood could chase away. As a child, she'd always thought the house felt alive, the way the walls groaned in the wind and the shadows shifted in the corners. Aunt Mildred had always laughed off her fears, brushing her hand over Karen's head and saying, "This house is just old, dear, nothing more." But that night, as Karen sat in the drafty living room sorting through Mildred's papers, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Occasionally, she thought she heard footsteps upstairs, but every time she checked, the rooms were empty. By the third day, the snowstorm had worsened. The power lines went down, plunging the house into darkness. Karen lit candles and tried to focus on her work, but the sense of unease grew stronger. It wasn't just the isolation or the storm. It was something deeper, something that seemed to emanate from the house itself. That night, as Karen lay bundled in blankets on the old couch, she heard it again. The sound of footsteps above her, slow and deliberate. She sat up, clutching the flashlight she'd brought with her, and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. Karen's heart pounded as she climbed the stairs, the beam of her flashlight trembling in her hand. At the top of the staircase, she saw it, a faint, flickering light coming from beneath the door to the master bedroom. Mildred's room. She pushed the door open, and the light vanished. The room was empty, save for the old four-poster bed and the heavy curtains that swayed slightly, though the windows were closed. Karen's breath formed pale clouds in the freezing air. As she turned to leave, something caught her eye, a small, ornate mirror on the vanity. It was the same mirror Mildred had always kept there, but now it seemed different. The glass was murky, almost like water, and as Karen stared, she thought she saw something moving within it. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the surface. For a moment, the image sharpened. She saw a figure, a woman in a long, dark dress, her face obscured by shadows. The woman raised a hand and pointed directly at Karen. Karen stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The mirror clattered to the floor, the glass shattering. She fled the room, slamming the door behind her, and didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, she tried to convince herself it had been a trick of the light, her imagination running wild in the dark. But the shattered mirror in the bedroom told a different story. Determined to finish her work and leave the house as soon as possible, Karen spent the day in the study, sorting through Mildred's old journals and documents. That's when she found it, a leather-bound diary, tucked away at the back of a drawer. The entries were dated decades ago, but the handwriting was unmistakably Mildred's. One entry, dated January 15th, 1974, caught Karen's attention. "I hear her at night, walking the halls. She always stops outside my door, but she never comes in. I don't know what she wants, but I can feel her watching me through the mirror. I've tried to get rid of it, but every time I move it, it finds its way back to the vanity. I've started keeping the door locked at night, but I don't think it will stop her if she decides to come in." Karen's blood ran cold. Mildred had always been a practical woman, not one to indulge in superstitions. If she had written this, then something had truly terrified her. That night, as Karen prepared to sleep, she locked the door to the master bedroom and moved a heavy dresser in front of it for good measure. She kept the flashlight and a kitchen knife within arm's reach, her nerves stretched to their breaking point. Sometime after midnight, she awoke to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the door. Karen sat up, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, mournful whisper. It sounded like a woman's voice, though Karen couldn't make out the words. Summoning every ounce of courage, she grabbed the flashlight and knife and crept toward the door. "Leave me alone," she shouted. The whispering ceased, and for a moment the silence was absolute. Then, the dresser began to slide across the floor as though pushed by an unseen force. Karen screamed, scrambling back toward the bed. The door creaked open, and the air grew frigid. In the dim light of the flashlight, she saw her breath swirling in front of her, and then she saw her. The figure from the mirror stood in the doorway, her face obscured by shadow. Her dark dress seemed to flow like smoke, and her presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The woman raised a hand and pointed at Karen, just as she had in the mirror. "Leave," she whispered, her voice hollow and echoing. Karen didn't need to be told twice. She bolted from the room, down the stairs, and out into the snow, her boots crunching loudly in the otherwise silent night. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. The house remained vacant after that. Karen never returned, and she refused to speak of what had happened to anyone, even the lawyer. But every January, as the snow falls and the wind howls through the trees, the locals say they can see a faint light flickering in the master bedroom window. A light that shouldn't be there. Story the end.
Story number 10.
January was always the loneliest month for Sarah. The long, dark nights and bitter cold seemed to stretch on forever, and this year felt particularly isolating. After her father's unexpected death in late December, she decided to spend a few weeks at his old farmhouse in rural Vermont, sorting through his belongings and tying up loose ends. The farmhouse was an austere, creaking structure that sat on a sprawling piece of land. It had been in their family for generations, passed down from one solitary caretaker to the next. Her father had lived there alone for years, rarely venturing into town, and Sarah hadn't visited much since she was a teenager. Something about the house had always made her uneasy, but now, as the sole heir, it was her responsibility to face it. From the moment she arrived, the house felt colder than it should have, even with the winter chill outside. Sarah attributed it to the poor insulation and the fact that the furnace hadn't been used in weeks. She built a fire in the living room's ancient hearth and set to work sorting through boxes of old photographs, letters, and keepsakes. On her first night, Sarah was awoken by a faint tapping sound. It was soft, almost rhythmic, like someone knocking on a distant door. At first, she thought it was the wind rattling the old windows, but when she got up to investigate, the sound stopped. She went back to bed, dismissing it as the house settling. The tapping returned the next night. This time, it was louder and more deliberate, coming from the direction of the front door. Sarah hesitated before heading downstairs to check, wrapping a blanket tightly around herself. When she opened the door, there was nothing outside but the pale glow of moonlight on the snow-covered fields. No footprints, no sign of anyone or anything that could have caused the noise. "Old houses make noises," she muttered to herself, closing and locking the door. But deep down, she felt something wasn't right. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. Lights flickered, even when there was no sign of faulty wiring. The sound of footsteps echoed through the upstairs hallway at night, though Sarah knew she was alone. The tapping at the front door became a nightly event, always at the same time, just after midnight. On the night of January 12th, Sarah woke with a start. Her bedroom was freezing, her breath visible in the dim light. The tapping had returned, louder than ever, but this time it was coming from inside the house. It echoed through the walls, reverberating in a way that made her skin crawl. She grabbed her phone and turned on its flashlight, gripping it tightly as she followed the sound. It led her to the small door under the staircase, one she hadn't opened since arriving. The tapping stopped as soon as she reached it, leaving an eerie silence in its place. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. The space beneath the stairs was small and cluttered with old tools and junk, but something caught her eye. A wooden box covered in dust and tied shut with twine. She pulled it out and carried it to the living room, where she sat by the fire and carefully opened it. Inside the box were old photographs, letters, and a small leather-bound journal. The photographs were black and white, depicting her father as a young boy alongside a woman Sarah didn't recognize. She assumed it was her grandmother, though the woman's face was stern and unsettling. The letters were addressed to her father from someone named M. They were cryptic, filled with warnings and pleas to stay away from the cellar. But it was the journal that sent chills down her spine. It belonged to her grandfather, a man she had never met but had heard stories about, none of them good. The entries were erratic, detailing strange events that had occurred in the house over decades, objects moving on their own, disembodied voices, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. One entry dated January 15, 1953, stood out. "I hear them at night, knocking, whispering. They want to be let in, but I know better. The house belongs to them now. It always has." Sarah slammed the journal shut, her heart racing. She decided then and there to leave the house the next morning, convinced the isolation and grief were playing tricks on her mind. But the house wasn't finished with her. That night she was woken by the sound of the cellar door creaking open. She had locked it earlier, of that she was certain, but now it stood ajar, a black void yawning into the basement. From the darkness came a faint, childlike whisper. "Come play with us." Sarah froze, every muscle in her body screaming at her to run, but she couldn't move. The voice came again, louder this time, and accompanied by the sound of small footsteps. "Come play with us, Sarah." Her name. They knew her name. Gathering every ounce of courage she had, Sarah grabbed her phone and bolted out of the house, not stopping until she was inside her car with the doors locked. She spent the night in a motel in town, too terrified to return. The next day, she hired a team of movers to pack up the house for her, giving them strict instructions to leave anything they found in the cellar untouched. She sold the farmhouse within weeks, never stepping foot in it again. Months later, Sarah received a call from the new owners. They wanted to know if she had ever experienced anything strange in the house. Their son had been waking up in the middle of the night, talking about the children who live in the walls. Sarah didn't answer their questions. She simply hung up the phone and blocked the number, determined to leave the memories of that January behind her. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she still hears it, the soft, rhythmic tapping at her door. Story the end.
Story number 11.
It was the first week of January, and the small town of Millstone had just begun to thaw after a heavy snowstorm. The chill of winter still clung to the air, but the promise of spring seemed far off. The kind of cold that gripped your bones, making every step in the deep snow feel like a challenge. It was during this bitter cold that Sarah found herself back in the house she had hoped to never return to. Sarah had grown up in Millstone, and the house on Elm Street had been her childhood home. But after her parents had died in a tragic car accident in November, Sarah left the town for a new life, hoping to distance herself from the memories. The house was left empty, locked up, and sealed away from the world. But when the lawyer contacted her in early January, she knew she couldn't avoid it any longer. The house had to be sold, and that meant Sarah had to go back. As she stepped out of the car and walked up the snowy path to the front door, she felt an unfamiliar heaviness. It was as if the house itself was watching her, waiting. The snow crunched beneath her boots, and the wind howled in the trees surrounding the property, creating an eerie soundtrack for her return. The house was exactly as she remembered, old, creaky, and covered in a thin blanket of frost. The shutters were askew, and the front porch looked like it hadn't been touched in years. A faint scent of mildew lingered in the air, a smell Sarah remembered all too well from her childhood. She fumbled with the keys, finally finding the right one and unlocking the door. The moment she stepped inside, the cold air hit her like a slap in the face. The warmth from the house had long since evaporated, leaving only a hollow emptiness behind. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she stepped further into the living room, and she couldn't help but feel a shiver crawl up her spine. The living room was dark, the curtains still drawn, casting the space in shadows. Sarah turned on the light and gasped. The room looked different. Her parents' old furniture, which had been so familiar, now seemed out of place. The chairs, the old bookshelf, even the fireplace. Everything looked wrong, like it had been shifted, rearranged without any rhyme or reason. And there, sitting in the middle of the room, was a small rocking chair, moving ever so slightly back and forth. Her heart skipped a beat. She was sure she hadn't placed it there. Her hands began to shake, but she told herself it was just the house playing tricks on her. It had been empty for months. The wind had probably caused the rocking chair to move, she thought, even though the air inside the house felt still and unnaturally cold. Sarah quickly moved through the house, checking each room one by one. She found nothing unusual, but the strange feeling lingered. Every room was dark and filled with silence, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. She eventually made her way upstairs to her old bedroom. The moment she entered the room, the cold intensified. The window, which had been cracked open the last time she visited, was now shut tightly, the frost on the glass telling her it had been closed for a while. The bed was made neatly, as if someone had been taking care of it, but there was something else, something unsettling. The mirror on the wall was fogged over, and in the fog, Sarah saw it. A figure. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. The shape was faint, just a blur in the mirror, but it seemed to be staring at her. Her breath caught in her throat as she took a step closer. The figure remained still, unmoving, but Sarah could feel its presence. The air grew even colder. Sarah reached out to touch the mirror, her hand trembling. As her fingers made contact with the glass, the figure seemed to move. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her face pale, her eyes dark and hollow. The woman stared at her and for a split second thought she saw her lips move. "Sarah." The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. A jolt of fear shot through her as she pulled her hand away from the mirror. Her heart pounded in her chest and her breath came in short gasps. The air was heavy with an overwhelming sense of dread. She couldn't explain it, but something was very wrong. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut behind her, causing her to jump in fright. Sarah rushed to open it, but the handle wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she tried to force the door open, but it remained locked, trapping her inside. She turned back to the mirror, her breath coming out in visible clouds as the temperature in the room plummeted, and then the figure in the mirror spoke again. "Sarah, you shouldn't have come back." Sarah's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. It was her mother's. The woman in the mirror began to change, her features warping into something unrecognizable. Her mother's face twisted into a grotesque mask of sorrow and rage. Her eyes bulged as if something was trying to escape from within them. Sarah's knees buckled beneath her as the air grew heavier, suffocating her with an unseen weight. The temperature in the room dropped so drastically that her breath turned to frost before her eyes. "Mom?" Sarah screamed, her voice cracking with terror. The figure in the mirror seemed to laugh, a low, guttural sound that echoed in the room. The walls groaned as if the house itself were alive, and the floorboards beneath Sarah's feet began to shake. The room tilted, spinning in a dizzying whirl of shadows and light. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, and she could almost taste the bitterness of decay on her tongue. In that moment, she felt it, the presence. It wasn't just her mother, not anymore. It was something else, something ancient and malevolent, lurking in the corners of the house, feeding off the memories that had been left behind. With a final scream, Sarah stumbled back, her hand finally breaking the lock on the door. She ran from the room, the sounds of footsteps chasing her from behind. She could feel the weight of the presence following her, pushing her to move faster. Down the stairs she went, stumbling as she tried to make her way out of the house. The front door, which had once been easy to open, now refused to budge. She pulled with all her might, but it was as though something inside the house had sealed her in. "Sarah!" The voice whispered from behind her. She turned, but no one was there. Only the empty hallway, the dark shadows stretching across the walls. With one last desperate pull, the door finally gave way, and Sarah was free. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, the snow crunching beneath her feet with every frantic step. She slammed the door shut and drove away without looking back. The house on Elm Street remained behind her, silent and still, but Sarah knew it was never really empty. The spirits of the past lingered there, trapped within the walls, waiting for the next visitor to uncover the horrors buried beneath the snow. Story the end.
Story number 12.
It was the first week of January when the strange events began. Alex had just moved into the old Victorian house on Birch Street, a property he had bought on a whim. The house had been sitting empty for nearly a decade, and though it was in need of serious renovation, Alex was excited about the prospect of making it his own. He had always been drawn to old houses, with their creaky floors and aged walls. This one, however, felt different from the start, heavy, as if it were waiting for something. The day he moved in, the air outside was crisp, and the sky had that peculiar winter stillness. No wind, no movement, just the constant hum of the world beneath the weight of snow. Inside, the house was cold, despite the furnace running at full blast. But Alex, used to old buildings, wasn't bothered. He assumed it was just the nature of the place. On the first night, after unpacking a few boxes, Alex sat down in the living room to relax. He noticed the house felt eerily silent, the kind of silence that pressed in on you, making your thoughts feel too loud. He tried to shake the feeling off and decided to go to bed early. The upstairs bedrooms were large and drafty, but he had chosen the room at the end of the hall, where the light from the street lamp outside filtered through the curtains. Just as he was about to fall asleep, a sound echoed through the hallway. It was faint, but it made his heart race. It was a soft thud, almost like a door closing, followed by the faintest scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor. His immediate thought was that it must be the house settling. But then came another noise, this one clearer. Footsteps. Someone or something was walking in the hall outside his room. Alex froze. The house was empty. He was alone. He had locked all the doors before going to bed, and yet the footsteps continued, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human. He stood up, trying to quiet his breath, and slowly crept toward the door. His hand was already on the doorknob when the footsteps stopped, as if they had heard him. The air grew unnervingly still. Alex opened the door and peered out into the hallway. The dim light from the street lamp outside barely illuminated the corridor. The space was empty. No sign of anyone moving about. Confused but not entirely frightened, he closed the door and went back to bed. It was probably just his imagination, he told himself. Maybe the house was playing tricks on him, making noises he wasn't used to. The next night, the footsteps returned. Again, it was around midnight. Alex had just gotten comfortable in bed when he heard them, slow, methodical steps dragging across the floor. The same scraping sound followed, as though someone was pulling something heavy along the hallway. This time, Alex didn't hesitate. He jumped out of bed and rushed to the door, throwing it open. The hallway was silent. He stood there for a moment, heart pounding, staring into the dimness of the corridor. The air seemed thick, almost too quiet, and Alex could feel a coldness that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. He glanced toward the stairs, but there was no one in sight. This wasn't right. There was no way this was just a settling house. He turned on the light and searched every room upstairs. The old floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he moved, but there was no sign of anyone. He checked the windows to make sure they were locked. He even inspected the attic, which was full of forgotten furniture covered in dusty sheets. Nothing. The rest of the night was uneventful, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was in the house with him. That sense of being watched lingered even when he was awake. He finally fell asleep in the early hours of the morning, only to be woken again at 3 a.m. by a loud banging sound followed by muffled voices. He shot up in bed, his heart racing. Alex wasn't sure what to do. He knew he had to find out what was going on, but fear kept him frozen in place. He decided to call the previous owners of the house the next day to ask if they had ever experienced anything strange. When the call connected, a woman's voice answered. "Yes, we still have some of the old paperwork for the house," she said. "But I don't know if you want to know about the history of the place. It's not exactly pleasant." Alex's curiosity deepened, but he pressed her to tell him what she knew. "It's an old house," she continued, "built in the 1800s. A family lived there until the early 1900s. The father, Samuel Holbrook, was a well-known merchant. But something happened around 1912. A fire. It started in the basement, and no one knows how. The entire family perished. They say Samuel was the last to die. He never left the house. After the fire, the place was abandoned for years. Some say his ghost still wanders the halls." The woman's voice trailed off, and Alex felt the air grow heavy. She went on to tell him that the house had been sold several times since then, but each family who had lived there had left, always under strange circumstances. There were rumors that the fire wasn't an accident, that Samuel's spirit still lingered, trapped in the place he had built with his own hands. "I should have warned you," she said finally. "But I didn't think you'd be interested in that. You should probably leave, though. It's not a safe place to be, not with all the stuff that's happened." Alex thanked her and ended the call, his mind racing. The footsteps, the scraping sound, the feeling of being watched. It all made sense now. It wasn't his imagination. The house was haunted. But Alex wasn't ready to leave. He had already invested so much time and money into fixing the place up, and he wasn't one to run from something so easily. He spent the next few days reading more about the house's history, piecing together what had happened during the fire. The more he learned, the more unsettled he became. There were accounts of strange occurrences that went back years, unexplained noises, sightings of a man in the basement, and whispers coming from the walls. Still, Alex decided to stay. The following week, as the cold January days stretched on, the disturbances continued. Every night, the footsteps would begin around midnight, growing louder and more frantic as if something or someone was searching for something. The scraping sound grew more persistent, now accompanied by the sound of a door opening and closing repeatedly. The house was never silent, as if the spirits of the past were endlessly trying to communicate. One night, unable to take it any longer, Alex decided to confront whatever was haunting him. He went to the basement, where the fire had started, armed with a flashlight and a heavy hammer. The air in the basement was thick and damp, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the stone walls. He called out to whatever was there. "I'm not leaving," he said, his voice shaky but firm. "If you're here, show yourself." For a long time, nothing happened. Then slowly he began to hear the faintest sound, a whisper, barely audible at first. It grew louder until Alex could make out words. "Help me." The flashlight flickered, casting wild shadows across the room. In the corner of his eye, he saw a figure, a man, tall and thin, with hollow eyes and a mouth that opened but didn't speak. "Please," the figure whispered, "help me." Alex turned to run, but as he did, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. The room went dark. The whispers filled his ears, each one more desperate than the last. That was the moment Alex knew. The house wasn't just haunted by the fire. It was haunted by the man who caused it, and as much as he wanted to leave, something told him it would never let him go. The next morning, Alex packed up his things and left the house behind. It was still January when he drove away, the snow falling thick and heavy around him. He never returned. Story the end.